Howdy all, grab yourselves a beer. It is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Now, I've been going through the various information that's been coming out about the Legion expansion, and I've got another new piece that's come out, and that is the upgraded Chieftain Ascendancy. There's been a thorough rework of this, and if you're wanting to keep in touch with all of the news that's coming out about 3.7, there's an excellent thread on Reddit that is being constantly updated by Viperesque, who's one of the moderators of the Path of Exile subreddit over there. It's an excellent resource on small changes and large ones, so definitely have a look at that. But here's the early look at the Chieftain Ascendancy. This was posted by Grinding Gear Games' community manager Bex. I'm going to go through quickly a bit of a summary of what's happening with this change. Now firstly, the Chieftain Ascendancy, it has an identity. It's one of the Marauder Ascendancies, and it is fire themed and physical themed. So it synergizes heavily with dealing physical damage. It does not really have much synergy with cold and lightning. It also has a lot of options for totem support, but is very functional as a melee or a caster, and it provides a considerable amount of durability to your character. There's quite a bit of deciding between how much you want to spec into offense or how much you want to spec into defense, but I'll just go through all of the various node options that you've got. So first up we have the endurance charge side of the Ascendancy, so that is 1, 2, 3 and 4 on this diagram. These are getting huge buffs from 3.6, and specifically Tawoa Forest Strength, which is this node here. So this is the 2-point node, not the 4-point node, that actually I think might be getting the biggest buff of all. It's going to give you a 35% chance to gain an endurance charge when you use a fire skill. Now there's a number of fire skills that are really good for this. The first one that comes to mind is Tectonic Slam. Tectonic Slam also has a 35% chance to consume an endurance charge when you use it, and when it does something pretty impressive. But it's not the only option. If you're casting Molten Shell constantly in combat, this may well be enough to keep you at full endurance charges. If you're using just a fire-based attack skill, whether that be fire-based attack or spell, so this could be Fireball or it could be Molten Strike, then in either case, this should keep you pretty full on endurance charges. Endurance charges are a pretty good defensive layer. You'll get a significant 4% physical reduction, incoming physical damage reduction per endurance charge that you have. Baseline, you've got the ability to gain 3 of them, but you can get that higher, and Velako Storm's Embrace will get it higher. It will get it higher and will also give you some damage for that investment. You also get 5% increased physical damage and 5% increased fire damage per endurance charge from this node, from Tower Forest Strength. Increased damage doesn't matter as much as more damage, but it's still nice to have. Then there is Velako Storm's Embrace, which is the 4-point investment. This gives you a considerable amount of life regeneration. If you've got 4 endurance charges, it's 2% life regen per second when you're at full endurance charges. But if you've got 8 endurance charges, as some builds will have, then suddenly you're looking at 4% regen. That's really significant, really meaningful, especially given that it will stack with other life regen that you get from the tree. But the big killer here is this. 3% more damage for each endurance charge lost recently, up to 15%. Now, more damage applies as a multiplier that applies to all of your damage. So if you've lost 5 endurance charges in the last 4 seconds, recently always means in the last 4 seconds, then you're going to be getting 15% more damage. If you can set up your character in such a way that you are both losing and gaining 5 endurance charges in every 4-second period, then this is quite a substantial buff, 15% more damage. Now there is a skill that is very good at consuming endurance charges, and that is Discharge. I'm not sure how I would go about building a Chieftain with Discharge, but I'm pretty sure that there is a cast on crit build available that will be certainly explored by some players. Cast on crit is something that there's certainly a section of the player base that absolutely loves to use it, and Discharge is definitely a good payload for cast on crit, so that's something to perhaps consider. Lastly, you get +1 maximum endurance charges, which is always good. Additionally, for each of the minor points that you take up in this area of the tree, You get 15% increased endurance charge duration, which is okay, but nothing special, and also 0.5% life regen per second. So this means that you're getting, if you spec into this side of the tree fully, you're going to get a lot of life regeneration, which is a pretty powerful level of defense. It is very, very good when enemies can't one-shot you, and in particular it is very good in the Eternal Labyrinth. I don't usually suggest farming the Eternal Labyrinth if you're if you're a veteran player to the game. I don't think it's nearly as lucrative as it was back when the Labyrinth was newer and a lot more people were having trouble getting through it. But if you're someone that's a bit newer to the game and you feel that getting Exile down is a major milestone for you in a given league, then this will certainly help you find both Exile and the traps in the Eternal Labyrinth a lot easier. So that's an option to consider. Next up, I'm not going to touch on the two on numbers 6, 8, and 10 yet. I'll come back to those later. I want to talk about the fire damage wheel down the bottom. This has been changed, and the layout that you see here, where it's a wheel, is basically set up so that you can spend 2, 4, or 6 points in here. And importantly, the one of these nodes that, while strong, is not strong for everyone, is Namahu Flames Advance. This can actually be detrimental to some builds, and it is set up in a way that Namahu is something you can take it, or you can path around it, and you can gain just the other nodes instead, as you see fit. So let's go through these 3 major nodes in the fire damage wheel. And firstly, I'll just state that these are all excellent, and taking 2, 4, or 6 points down here is, all of these are viable options. So first up, you have Namahu Flames Advance. 50% of physical damage converted to fire damage. So this means that if you were going to deal 100 physical damage, you now deal 50 physical and 50 fire damage, but then this is scaled by both your physical and your fire damage. On its own, that's not very good, but if you're converting all of your damage into elements, then there's a lot of potential to scale up all of your damage via things like fire penetration and various other shenanigans involving effects that add extra elemental damage as chaos damage that you can get on things like the Atzuri Flask, Atzuri's Promise, the Shroud of Eternity unique item, which I think is going to get nerfed in 3.7, but we'll have to wait and see, and various other options as well. Shaper weapons can have affixes that do that. There's a whole bunch of different options. In any case, Namahu is very strong. All of the time, it's giving you 50% conversion from physical to fire, and every 10 seconds, it also gains 100% of your physical damage as extra fire damage for 4 seconds. So that has a 40% uptime, and you won't really notice this while you're clearing maps, but when you come across tougher monsters, so either you've gotten to a particularly tanky rare, or you've gotten up to the boss of the map, maybe a rogue exile, or maybe potentially even something in the new Legion content, you will find that this will be a huge boost to your average damage over time, just not necessarily a boost to every single hit that you do. It's more powerful than it looks. It's essentially mathematically about equivalent to 40% increased, 40% of your physical damage added as extra fire all the time, but it's not as consistent as that. However, still very strong. Next up, we have Heinekora Death's Fury. This is not available unless you take 4 points. 1% of fire damage leached as life. That is potentially huge, given that the Chieftain excels at dealing pure fire damage. 20% chance to cover rare or unique enemies in Ash for 10 seconds on hit. Now, firstly, 20% chance to inflict a 10-second debuff means that for the first couple of seconds while you're fighting a boss, it won't be active, but then once you do proc it once, it will probably always be active on them, unless and until they have an extended invulnerability phase. When an enemy is covered in Ash, they have 20% less movement speed, 20% increased fire damage taken. So, and by default it lasts for 4 seconds, but on this, when you get it via this means it lasts for 10. That is really, really strong. So, Heinekora Death's Fury also gives you 10% increased strength. Strength always means life. Even if you're not a build that is stacking strength, strength will always benefit you via giving you more life. There are also ways to attempt to stack strength for either the unique weapon Brutus's Lead Sprinkler, or alternately for some of the Shaper caster sticks that add a percentage of increased area of effect for each based upon your strength. So as a scaling based upon your strength. I believe you can get that on scepters and maces. I could be wrong, and it may only be on one-handed maces or only on one-handed scepters. But in any case, it's an option that you can get on Shaper items. Last up in this wheel, we have Rumiko Sun's Light. 25% chance to ignite, 15% more burning damage. Again, that is a multiplier, being more. And damage penetrates 15% fire resistance. Of note here, getting real benefit out of Ignite can be difficult. It does allow you to get quite a bit of benefit out of the Immolate support gem, although I don't think at the moment that Immolate support is in a great place. We'll have to see if it gets rebalanced in this patch. If it does get rebalanced though, and if the damage numbers on it were to be raised, then in that situation, Immolate support gets quite a bit of benefit out of you having a pretty sure chance to ignite monsters. Damage penetrating 15% fire resistance is amazing. Against the Shaper, if you have no penetration at all, you go from he has 40% fire resistance by default. So you go from dealing 60% of your default damage up to dealing 75%. This is a massive 25% more multiplier on your damage against bosses. It's not quite as good as that because you'll probably have some fire penetration from other sources, so it won't stack quite as well as you might like, but it is still a very, very, very potent node, and one that is very compelling choice to take. And one thing I really like here is that essentially 1, 3, 16, 12, and 14 are all very compelling choices to take for a build that is looking to deal physical and fire damage together. And you're going to have some difficult choices to make there if you're playing a melee build that is specialized in dealing fire damage. Now let's have a look at the other three nodes that aren't part of the fire wheel. First up, we have the Tassalio Cleansing Water node in the middle. This is a bit better than it looks. Firstly, 2% life regen per second is amazing. Second, 100% increased fire resistance. Now, I know everyone's thinking, fire resistance, yeah, I just get that on gear. But essentially what this does is at endgame, or at early endgame when your gear is not great, this frees up 3 additional affix slots on your equipment. Because you're going to have a lot of rare items dedicated to providing your resistances, and your average roll on those rares is going to be about in the mid-30s. So that's going to mean that you need 3 less affixes, and they can be replaced by other affixes on items. Later on, it's no longer really 3 because when you've got outstanding gear, your resists are probably in the 45 to 48 range mostly on items, and so at that point it becomes worth 2 affixes. However, these can be replaced by damaging affixes like increased crit multiplier, increased critical chance, all sorts of things like that, or by other utility effects. So this is stronger than it looks, and I would suggest that you do take this node seriously. You're not necessarily going to take it, but at least consider it seriously. You're unaffected by Ignite, which is great. And you have 50%, you have 10% of physical damage that you suffer from hits is taken as fire damage. This is much better than it sounds. The reason for this is that you're probably running around at endgame with 75% fire resistance, but it is very, 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 very difficult to get 75% mitigation against physical damage. So if you take a hit for 3,000 physical damage, instead taking 2,700 of that as physical, which you might only mitigate 10% of, so 2,700 damage less 10% is 2,430, and then the other 300 damage is taken as fire, of which you mitigate 75%. So you're taking 2,505 damage after this node's effect, is considered. If you did not have this node, you would have taken 2,700 from that hit. That's with your 10% physical mitigation. You'll notice that there's a considerable decrease in the total damage that you've taken on your character, and that's why that's a strong defensive node. Lastly, 50% increased life recovery rate if you have taken fire damage from an enemy hit recently. Increased life recovery rate is an incredibly powerful stat, and so Tassalio is a very solid option if you want to both survive bigger hits and recover quicker from the smaller ones. And so in that sense, it's something that you might consider as an alternative to the endurance charge route, although I think the endurance charge route is so good that you perhaps would take that instead. Next up we have the Totem node, Arongui Moon's Presence, and I'm probably saying a lot of these names wrong. Totems are immune to fire damage. Yep, you're not going to knock that, but it's not great. Enemies near your totems deal 8% less damage. Enemies near your totems take 16% increased physical and fire damage. So this is one of those nodes. It's all upside if you're playing a totem build, and it's completely useless if you're not. Worth considering if you're playing a totem build. In fact, if you are playing a totem build, it's probably one of the reasons you're considering going a Chieftain, although you may also want to consider the Templar Hierophant. And last up, we have Tukahama War's Herald, which is also a totem node. 1% of damage dealt by your totems is leached to you as life. 50% increased effect of buffs granted by your active ancestor totems. So this is Ancestral Warchief and the other related skills. Ancestor totems have 100% increased activation range and 25% increased area of effect while you have a totem. Essentially, your Ancestral Protector and Ancestral Warchief skills, this is something that you would take if and only if you are considering playing one of those builds. So now let's just talk quickly about build ideas for the new Chieftain. The first option is to pick a physical skill that converts into fire damage. One that you may want to consider is Consecrated Path, and then scale up fire damage and on the tree and fire penetration. This is really straightforward and simple. Your character is going to deal lots of fire damage, and you're going to set enemies on fire because you're covering them in ash, and you're just going to keep dealing lots and lots of damage while you are a moderately tanky melee, but not extraordinarily tanky. It's a good hybrid of offense and defense, and it's something that I would suggest if you're wanting to be up close and personal in combat. If you're going to go this route, I would suggest that you either take the entire 4 endurance charge nodes and then any 4 of the wheel down here, or alternately, you could take just the endurance charge generating node and all of the wheel except for one of the 4 miners. Of course, you may also want to consider Tassalio Cleansing Water as an alternate option. Really, that's up to you, and it's not too hard to respec. Once you're at endgame, it's not too hard to respec your Ascendancy points. If, for instance, you decide you want to test Tassalio and you don't like it, then at that point you can just unspec it and take Tawoa Forest Strength, and that'll only cost you 10 Orbs of Regret, which, 10 Orbs of Regret is not a trivial cost early in the league, but by the time that you're established, it's just a case of run 4 maps and you'll have enough currency to trade for those. Second suggestion is to pick a purely physical skill, so this could be something like Heavy Strike or any skill like that, that doesn't have any built-in conversion. It doesn't necessarily need to be a physical attack either. You could conceivably use this approach with physical spells like Bladefall, although I don't think Bladefall's in a very strong position at the moment. Convert 50% of your damage to fire by using Namahu, and then use Avatar of Fire, either from taking the keystone on the tree or from using the item Zoph's Blood, which there is conveniently a new divination card for, and get full conversion this way. So you're dealing all of your damage, all of your physical damage is converted into fire. And because you're using Avatar of Fire, you're actually incapable of dealing chaos damage, cold damage, lightning damage, or physical damage. Then scale your fire damage into the stratosphere. The third option that I would suggest considering is to pick a skill that inherently deals physical damage, but that partially converts that to non-fire, so to a non-fire element. So Glacial Cascade or Smite would be 2 examples here. Glacial Cascade converts from memory at 60% of damage into cold. Smite converts 50% into lightning damage, and there's other options as well. And then use Namahu to add more elemental conversion. So you're now, the way that conversion works in the game, it will take the skill gem that you're using. So in this case, if we say Glacial Cascade, which is 60, which deals physical damage, then converts 60% of that to cold, it will deal 60% cold and 40% fire. You won't get that powerful double dip effect of getting 60% cold and then 50% fire when you overconvert. It'll be capped at 100% total, and the conversion provided by the gem will be prioritized. Now then you will scale this damage, this multiple elements damage, which could be just lightning and fire, it could be lightning and cold and fire, or it could be just cold and fire. You'll then scale this up into the stratosphere potentially by using the unique item Skin of the Lightless, Shroud of the Lightless, which drops from Abyssal Liches. And this isn't something you can count on having access to early if you're a solo self-found player, but it's pretty accessible in a trade league pretty soon. One advantage of Shroud of the Lightless is that it only needs to be 5-linked. It has one Abyssal socket on it. It's an armor. It has an Abyssal socket on it, and you then can 5-link the rest of it. Normally you wouldn't be happy using a 5-link, but the bonus here is that your socketed gems are supported by a level 20 elemental proliferation, which is a skill gem players can't get, but that it gives penetration against all 3 elements, so it's quite a good way of scaling it. There'll be potentially more options that will become available once all of the skill gems are revealed, but for the moment that's 3 ideas I would have on how to consider building a Chieftain. You could also go with totems. I've never enjoyed the totem playstyle that much. I've tried it a couple of times and just haven't found it fun, but by all means do give it a go and see, because it's a polarizing playstyle. Some people love it, some people don't. Anyways, if you've got any questions, then feel free to leave them below. Otherwise, if you've got any other suggestions, fire them away, and I'll consider. Chieftain's not something I'm considering as my first choice of Ascendancy for the new league, but I'm open to having my mind changed, particularly when we see the skill gem changes next week.